Hi, it's Rabbi Travis again. Hope everyone's doing well. I wanted to try something a little different for this lecture. I told you I was going to do some research on voter fraud. It's a complicated issue. And what I want to do, what I've done is I prepared a PowerPoint presentation, which I will share with you on my screen. So I'll be doing essentially voiceover. I think this will make it easier to follow some of the complexities of the issues. It'll allow me to show some, show some charts and graphs. It also has the advantage of giving you an opportunity to pause. If we were doing this live, I think this is a lecture I would do in two parts. And so if I haven't started yet, I don't know how long it's going to take, but if it goes on too long, feel free to pause it. If it's boring, feel free to leave it. No hard feelings. If you leave it, I won't know. So with that in mind, I'm going to share my screen and find the presentation. We'll get started. So the issue about voter fraud seems to me is one of asking the right question. In other words, is there really voter fraud, or those who are raising the issue, are they themselves perpetuating fraud, meaning that the issue is not a real issue? And I think it's worth contemplating this question. That's what I'm going to try and do in this presentation. Maybe, here we go. So the truth is, voter fraud does exist. And I think we'd all agree that any type of voter fraud is serious. And there's no type of voter fraud that is harmless. In other words, someone is cheating. The question is, how big an impact does it have? There are many types of voter fraud, electoral fraud, as we will talk about, that have little to no effect on our democracy and on our elections. So the type of fraud that allows one candidate to steal an election from another is bad. It is a threat to democracy. If one or two individuals double vote, vote under false pretenses, doesn't impact the election. Not something that we should ignore, but it doesn't raise, in my mind, to the level of a five-alarm fire, which is how some people view the issue. I want to just mention parenthetically, before we get into the meat of the discussion, ironically, the only major voter fraud we've had in recent years happened in North Carolina in the 2018 election, where a Republican running for the House of Representatives falsified nearly 1,000 mail-in ballots, and that's how he won the election. It was uncovered, and the House did not certify the election, and I think that seat's still vacant. They're still fighting over it. So it's just ironic that the only real example of significant voter fraud in recent years has been in a Republican election, and it's Republicans who seem to be raising the issue over and over again. Now, in fairness, the left and the right, and let's exclude really radicals, the radical right, Democrats and Republicans alike, I think everyone would agree that we need to protect our democracy from voter fraud. They just have different opinions on how this should be done. And this divergence of opinion is not new, as we will see later in our presentation. The difference of opinion manifests itself in how the problem of voter fraud is defined, and also about the scope of the problem itself. How do we measure it? Is it very widespread, or is it rare? So we're going to see the left and the right, Democrats and Republicans, they have very different views and opinions on the issue. For example, the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, argues that the problem of voter fraud is as old as the country itself. And as evidence, they bring a U.S. Supreme Court decision, which noted when it upheld Indiana's voter identification law, quote, "Fragrant examples," close quote, of voter fraud have been documented throughout this nation's history by respected historians and journalists. Great. I don't think people deny that it exists. The question is, again, how do we measure it, and how extensive is it? The Heritage Foundation continues, attempts to commandeer election results have been documented dating back to the 19th century, when New York City's infamous Tammany Hall was synonymous with political corruption and election fraud. In one New York election, 1844, 55,000 votes were recorded, even though there were only 41,000 eligible voters. That's cheating. Of course, it's also 180 years ago. Decades later, these efforts have continued, and determined fraudsters have become only more creative in their efforts to fix the outcomes of elections. That's the view of this conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation. Again, 1844, everyone would have to agree that was atrocious, that was outrageous. It was blatant cheating and blatantly wrong. Conversely, while acknowledging the existence of voter fraud, liberals tend to focus on current trends, such as this fact. Out of 197 million votes cast for federal candidates between 2002 and 2005, only 40 voters were indicted for voter fraud. Only 26 of those cases, or about 0.00000013% of the votes cast, resulted in convictions or guilty pleas. Okay, so I think we'd all agree that that smaller percentage, 40 votes out of 197 million, means nothing. So this is part of the debate. 1844 was outrageous. 2002 to 2005, there seems to be very little voter fraud. So what are we really fighting about? So before we get into some of the debates about how extensive it is, let's define what we mean when we say voter fraud. Voter fraud isn't limited to one type of voter fraud or even common types of voter fraud. It is simply illegal tampering with the process of an election. And I think, as you can imagine, this illegal tampering can take many, many different forms. How one defines voter fraud reflects one's political leanings. And let me show you what I mean. Let's talk about, how does the right define voter fraud? So the right, and by right, could mean conservatives, you can talk about the Republican Party, however you want to label that group of our citizens. The right tends to focus on, one, impersonation fraud at the polls. This is voting in the name of another legitimate voter, or in the name of a voter who has died, moved away, lost the right to vote because they are felons, but remain registered. Some states have denied felons, convicted felons, the right to vote. This is very contentious, for instance, in Florida in recent years. There's been moves to reinstate the right to vote. There are, I don't remember the exact number, I think it was somewhere between 50 and 80,000 people in Florida who had served prison time, paid the price for the crime. They're out of prison, but Florida still denies them the right to vote. They tried to restore it. I think there was a state referendum, or the legislature passed it and the governor vetoed it, but felons don't get to vote in certain states. So if I'm a felon and I use my brother's ID card, that's impersonation fraud. False registrations, voting under fraudulent voter registrations that either use a phony name and a real or fake address or claim of residence in a particular jurisdiction where the registered voter doesn't actually live, is not entitled to vote. So, for instance, my primary residence is here in Atlanta. I vote in DeKalb County, where I live. I have a cabin up in Gilmer County. So I guess I could vote in the Gilmer County elections because I am a resident there, even though I'm only there, I don't know, 24 weekends a year. I don't know. So false registrations. And by the way, what the right focuses on, and there's still some more points, the left doesn't disagree with. Everyone would agree that these examples I'm talking about right now constitute voter fraud, whether you're right, left, Democrat, or Republican. The question is, what do you focus on? So the right continues. Duplicate voting, registering multiple locations and voting in the same election in more than one jurisdiction or state. So come November, if I got up early in the morning and voted here in DeKalb County and then drove up to Gilmer County and voted again, that's duplicate voting. Fraudulent use of absentee ballots. That's requesting absentee ballots and voting without the knowledge of the actual voter. Someone asks for a ballot in my name. This is something older folks like you and me should be concerned about, that people will try and get an absentee ballot in your name and use your name to vote, or obtaining the absentee ballot from a voter and either filling it in directly or forging the voter's signature or legally telling the voter who to vote for. So, for instance, I hope all of you will vote this November. I hope all of you will ask for absentee ballots if you can't get to the polls. You should fill those in yourself. You should sign those ballots yourself. Someone else filling in your ballot and signing your name is fraudulent use of an absentee ballot. Buying votes, that's old school. Tammany Hall was famous for buying votes. You pay people to vote for one person. Another example is illegal assistance at the polls, forcing or intimidating voters, particularly the elderly, disabled, illiterate, and those for whom English is a second language, to vote for a particular candidate while supposedly providing them with quote unquote assistance. This in the 50s and the 60s, this sort of intimidation went on all over the South when legally registered African American voters would show up at voting polls, and there'd be lots of white people with shotguns. You know, if you were a black person in Alabama showing up to vote and there were several people with shotguns standing outside the voting location, you probably didn't go in to vote. Or if you went in to vote and they gave you a suggestion on who to vote for, you might do that also. Illegible voting. All right, this is legal registrations and voting by individuals. I'm sorry, ineligible voting. This is legal registrations, voting by individuals who are not U.S. citizens, who are convicted felons, again, if in those states that don't allow felons to vote, or otherwise not eligible to vote. I vote in November, but I don't turn 18 until December 1st, okay? Altering the vote count, okay, that everyone would agree. You change the vote count. Now, it's in theory harder now that we've moved to electronic voting in so many states, but Georgia's doing both. They're supposed to have paper backup in case the computers get hacked. We're going to talk about the Georgia primary election that happened just a few weeks ago. It was a disaster, and it doesn't bode well for November. Ballot petition fraud, forging the signatures of registered voters on ballot petitions that must be filed with election officials in some states for a candidate or an issue to be listed on the official ballot. So if I wanted to have it on the November election that sale of alcohol is illegal, I want to go back to good old days of prohibition. And to get something on the ballot, you need, I'm going to make up the number, but they're typically something like 50,000 or 100,000 signatures. You forge those signatures or some of those signatures and get the issue on the ballot, that's ballot petition fraud. So again, let me be clear before we move on to what the left talks about. The left would not disagree with any of those examples, but the right tends to focus only on those. The left has a much broader notion of voter fraud. And so their list of examples would continue and would include the following as being forms of voter fraud. Electorate manipulation. So you play with demography and you disenfranchisement. This is, we'll talk about in Georgia, for instance, purging the voter registration list. Georgia tried to, and it's been in court, if you haven't voted in 2 elections in a row, they take you off the voting list. Whose business is it if I choose not to vote 2 times in a row? I would have thought that my right to vote is guaranteed as being a citizen of this country, okay? So if states are trying to manipulate those lists, the left would see that as its form of voter fraud. Intimidation. Violence or the threat of violence, attacks on polling places, legal threats, economic threats. The left sees this as a form of voter fraud. I think the better way to describe it would be voter suppression, which is a term you hear with increasing frequency. If you try and scare people away from voting, that's voter suppression. Misleading or confusing paper ballots. Oh, this happens all the time, especially um, when they're trying to amend state constitutions, right? So you present misleading ballot papers, like vote yes to vote no, and the question phrase, not legalizing marriage equality. So if I didn't, what does that mean, not legalizing? So not legalizing means I'm making it illegal, but not legalizing makes it legal. So if I'm in favor of marriage equality, I'd have to read this 3 times to understand that not legalizing marriage equality means that I want to legalize marriage equality and vote yes. But when I see not legalizing marriage equality, I read it quickly. I think, oh no, they don't want to legalize marriage equality, and I'm going to vote no. So I know for myself, whenever there are issues up for vote in November of election years, I make sure I read through them in advance before I get to the voting booth, and I've read them carefully, and I've looked to understand what they really mean. To try and figure something out in the voting booth can be very confusing. So the left sees this as a form of voter fraud. Gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering, I think we've spoken about this before. Gerrymandering is as follows. Each state legislature determines the districts for members of the House of Representatives. So we use Georgia as an example. Georgia gets 2 senators, as every state does, and those elections are statewide. Georgia has currently 14 members in the House of Representatives. So the state legislature, based on census data, which is taken every 10 years, decides how to draw these districts. Gerrymandering means if I'm able, I group certain demographics in the same area. So I might, East Cobb is a good example. East Cobb is seen as a very conservative part of Atlanta, and the district's been drawn to ensure that there's a majority of white, we don't know that they're conservative, but they tend to be more conservative in East Cobb people, so that's a safe Republican seat. Or you draw these weird districts so that you cluster black voters, let's say, in 1 or 2 districts. The presumption is that the black voters vote for black candidates, and you limit the number of black voter elected officials who will go to the House. Or you divvy up the black population in such a way that the blacks or people of color are minorities in every election district. And again, the presumption is that whites vote for whites, people of color vote for people of color. The Supreme Court has held that gerrymandering on the basis of race is unconstitutional, but gerrymandering based on politics is constitutional. The Republican Party, for the past 15 or 20 years, has really focused a lot of its effort on winning elections at the state level, taking control of the state legislatures so that they could redraw the voting districts and help them seize control of the House. And there are some seats, there are some districts in Georgia and other states that if you're a Republican, you can do whatever you want and say whatever you want because it's a safe Republican district. So if you gerrymander in a way that protects the political power of Republicans or Democrats when they're in power, let's be fair, gerrymandered also to try and give themselves an advantage. Not to the extent currently done by the Republicans, but they weren't angels either. But gerrymandering is considering a vote by the left a form of voter fraud. Voter suppression, suppressing eligible voters by any legal or illegal means in state, local, and federal elections. This is what's been discussed a lot. We're going to talk about it more in Georgia. It was a big issue leading up to the 2018 election when Stacey Abrams ran for governor and lost in a relatively close election. She's worked tirelessly in the state to focus attention, both statewide and nationally, on voter suppression, not only in Georgia, but around the country. So the left sees those other issues as in addition to what the right focuses on, not instead of. So again, the left has a broader definition of what constitutes voter fraud. The right tends to focus on, for lack of a better term, is plain old cheating. Now, let's talk about facts versus theory. And you'll see why I want to talk about facts versus theory. The disagreements between the right and the left also extend on how one looks at the facts, which sadly is very true about so many things in life, whether it's global warming or the COVID-19 pandemic. People on the left, people on the right look at the same set of facts, and you wouldn't know they're looking at the same set of facts. If you doubt this, take a day or two and watch CNN and then watch Fox, or watch MSNBC and then watch Fox News. Watch them cover the same story, and you're going to scratch your head because they don't seem to be talking about the same story. Okay, so what does this have to do with voter fraud? All right, the right tends to look at, or wants to overlook facts and focus on the theoretical impact of voter fraud. I'm going to give you some examples, to try and support that. So let's again look at the Heritage Foundation's take on the issue. And the language here is from the website of the Heritage Foundation. When I send this video to Amanda to share with you, I'm going to share with her a list of the online sources I used. If you'd like to see some of them yourself, hopefully she'll share them with you. So the Heritage Foundation writes on their website, liberal groups often claim that known instances of voter fraud are inconsequential when compared to the total number of ballots cast in American elections. However, as the National Commission on Federal Election Reform has stated, the problem is not the magnitude of voter fraud. In closer disputed elections, and there are many, a small amount of fraud could make the margin of difference. That's true. The U.S. Supreme Court has concurred with this assessment, noting that known instances of voter fraud demonstrate that not only is the risk of voter fraud real, but that it could affect the outcome of a close election. All right, so the right talks about what could be. And we'll see. They don't tell me about 197 million ballots cast in close local elections. The handful of fraudulent ballots could turn the election. That's what we're concerned about. The question is, does it really happen or not? So we've seen according to a Heritage Foundation, recent elections bear out this point. In 2015, a city council election in the New Jersey town of Perth Amboy was decided by a mere 10 votes. A judge overturned the election and ordered a new one after it was revealed that at least 13 illegal absentee ballots had been cast. The 2003 mayoral primary in East Chicago, Indiana, was overturned by the state Supreme Court after evidence of widespread fraud was revealed. The new election resulted in a different winner. Numerous convictions for election fraud resulted from this election and are documented in the Heritage Foundation's voter fraud database. If you want to see that database, if you Google the Heritage Foundation, you can see it on their website. So the right would say, again, don't talk about 197 million votes. Talk about the 10 votes in this little town in Perth Amboy, which could have made a difference and did make a difference. The left, however, is not so interested in what ifs. The left tends to look closely at facts and figures, like this one. Between 2000 and 2010, there were 649 million votes cast in general elections and 13 cases of in-person voter impersonation convictions. That is, 13 people were convicted of showing up at the polls and claiming to be somebody else. So I found this cute graphic. In the same time period, when 649 million votes were cast, there were 47,000 UFO sightings. There were 441 Americans killed by lightning, and there were 13 credible cases of in-person voter impersonation. It's not a lot. So the theory, yes, it takes place. The question is, does it really impact elections? Here's another chart to look at. Since 2000, this was reported in the Wall Street Journal, there were just over 2,000 cases of alleged election fraud. They break out into this percentage. 23% involved absentee ballots, 19% were registration issues, almost 13% casted ineligible ballots, you had 7% double voted, you had 0.5% of voter impersonation. So, but look at the raw numbers. 2,000 out of millions and millions and millions of votes cast. So again, we shouldn't turn a blind eye to voter fraud. The question is, how do you combat it? Do you have laser-like focus and try and have very specific remedies for specific problems? Or do you have, forgive the analogy, like a shotgun blast where you're scattered all over the place? And we're going to talk about that shortly. Here's another example. This again reflects the statistic I shared with you between 2002 and 2005. Only 40 voters were indicted for voter fraud out of 197 million votes cast. So you see, vote buying, there were 50 total cases, 10 were dismissed. So you had 40 convictions. Voting by people who were ineligible, 10 were dismissed, you had 18. Multiple voting, 4 were acquitted or dismissed, you had 5. You had 5 cases of voter fraud, 3 cases, only 1 was acquitted, only 2 cases of civil rights violations. Again, there's fraud going on. But is it enough for us to get, as some people have gotten, hysterical over the issue? So let's go further. I want to share a little bit of comic relief from an old liberal. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the comic strip Doonesbury. That's Mike Doonesbury in the illustration there. This strip was created by Gary Trudeau back in 1968 when he was a student at Yale University. I became acquainted with Doonesbury when I started college in '76 in Dartmouth College up in New Hampshire, and I read the Boston Globe daily, and I became hooked. I've read Doonesbury every day since then. And what's interesting, many papers when he was still running a daily strip, today he only has Sunday strip, his daily strips would not be in the comic page, but it would be on the editorial page because it was seen and is a very political cartoon. So this series I want to share with you is from July 2012. And Gary Trudeau nails, I think, gets to the heart of the issue here. So I'm going to read through and I'll show you the strips. So this MC is an old character of his. His name is Mark Slackmeyer. Mark is the sort of like an NPR radio host these days. And he says, again, this is from July 2012. You thought he was gone. You thought he was history. Well, folks, you were wrong. From the courthouses of Alabama to the polls of Pennsylvania, this old boy is back. So put your hands together, America, and give it up for Mr. James Crow. Yeah, good God. And we all know about the Jim Crow laws. So you can guess where this strip is going. The return of Jimmy Crow. Sup, America? Y'all been feeling the new love for voter suppression? I sure have. So come with me to check it out on my nationwide Jimmy Crow comeback tour. First stop, Alabama. Here in Bama, the GOP passed a badass new Jimmy Crow law to keep undesirables away from the polls. Here he comes. Well, smoke my ribs. All white fraud busters. Jimmy. All right, clearly, Gary Trudeau has picked Jimmy Crow here, because most states engaged in efforts at voter suppression are targeting blacks and other minorities, people of color. Jimmy Crow's comeback tour. Rolling into Pennsylvania, y'all. Mercy. Check it out. To fight voter fraud, the GOP passed a Jimmy Crow law that could keep 750,000 eligible voters away. So how many cases of voter ID fraud has Pennsylvania recorded in the last 8 years? It must be a lot. Oops, 0. Oh well, on to Florida. Let that sink in. No cases of recorded ID fraud in 8 years, and they wanted to pass a draconian bill to purge the polls. And by the way, in that election season, elected official in Pennsylvania was recorded saying they'll do whatever they need to do to suppress the vote so that Romney could win Pennsylvania in 2012. I think that's part of what prompted Trudeau to include Pennsylvania in Jimmy Crow's comeback tour. Welcome to the Sunshine State. where voter suppression is in full swing for 12. Here in Florida, the GOP fights fraud by purging rolls of ineligible voters. Sounds good to me. Uh-oh. In the first round, 20% of the purgees were actually eligible. Oh, heck, it's Florida. Who'll notice? From Florida to Maine, 1,600 miles as the crow flies. Here in Maine, folks love to vote. They're tops in turnout. Sadly, too many of them are Democrats who like to steal elections, according to the GOP chair, Charlie Webster. The GOP solution? A new voter ID bill to curb Maine's shocking wave of fraud. At least 2 instances in 38 years. That's right, 2. The same number of confirmed Bigfoot sightings. Coincidence? You decide. Satch what? Sasquatch with a Q. This was my favorite of these strips. Last one here. Yep, from Arizona to Nebraska to Indiana to Georgia to Wisconsin, Jimmy Crow is back. Wherever minorities or students or the elderly line up to vote, the GOP is there to catch them. So is voting fraud for real? Not according to a 5-year Bush administration investigation. Meh. But who trusts Bush? He stole Florida, so don't forget to vote if you can. So, tongue-in-cheek perhaps, but the figures he quotes in these strips are accurate. And I think it, again, I brought it to highlight, are we interested in fact, or are we interested in theory? If you've had 2 cases of voter ID fraud in 38 years in Maine, I don't think you need to be passing harsh voter identification laws. If you've had 0 ID fraud in Pennsylvania in 8 years, why would you try to dramatically purge your voter registrations list? Well, because in theory, someone can cheat. So if factually speaking, there's almost no voter fraud, what are so many people, especially GOP elected officials, so concerned about? That's the burning question in my mind. So let's see if we can answer that. Perhaps something else is afoot. So I want to take a look at the history of voter suppression, again, to help give a context to it. This is not an extensive list by any means. And raising fears of voter fraud in order to make it harder for people, particularly people fitting certain demographic profiles, for making it harder for them to vote, didn't start with the Trump administration or even in the past 100 years. As Harvard historian Alexander Keesar lays out in his 2000 book, The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in the United States, the tactic dates back to the early decades of the 19th century. Throughout US history, politicians and activists gimmed up stories about fraud in order to keep their opponents from the polls. This is as Kessler writes, legislative debates were sprinkled heavily with tales of ballot box stuffing, miscounts, hordes of immigrants lined up to vote as the machines, meaning the political machine, instructed, men trooping from precinct to precinct to vote early and often, right? And if you say it loud enough and often enough, if you have a network like Fox parroting and disseminating such tales over and over and over, it's easy to see how a significant part of the population can come to believe these. So here's an incomplete timeline. 1836, Pennsylvania passed its first voter registration law. The law applied only to Philadelphia, where it required assessors to go door to door to compile a list of eligible voters. To cast a ballot, a voter had to be on the list. Although the proclaimed goal of the law was to reduce fraud, opponents insisted that its real intent was to reduce the participation of the poor, who were frequently not home when the assessors came by and did not have big brass nameplates on their doors, as Kessler writes. Sound a little familiar? 1866, California passed a restrictive registration requirement aimed at quelling fears about voter fraud committed by immigrants. Democrats considered it an act of hostility to the Democratic Party. To register, naturalized citizens had to present the county clerk with their original court-sealed naturalization papers. In the absence of such papers, an immigrant's eligibility could be established only through the testimony of 2 householders and legal voters, and by residents in the state for a full year, double the normal requirement. The deadline to register was 3 months before the general election. (1866 through 67), New Jersey. There, Republicans erected a series of hurdles under the pretense of fighting fraud. Everyone who wished to cast a ballot had to register in person the Thursday before the general election. Anyone could challenge the credentials of would-be registrants, and anyone not on the list on election day could not vote. Right? So what if you couldn't get there on Thursday? What if you had a group of people there to challenge everyone from one party or the other? Right? Democrats protested that the laws discriminated against the poor who couldn't take time off to work to register. As an aside, I'll mention the United States is the only Western democracy that the day of federal elections is not a holiday. Right? If you're an hourly worker and you have to take off 2, 3, 4 hours to work, which means you don't get paid, or if you take off 2, 3, 4 hours, you have to take off a whole day to vote, you might not vote because you might not be able to afford taking off the time. That's why every other Western democracy declares it a federal holiday. Nobody works. Everyone can go to vote. Let's continue. Those registration laws varied in the ensuing decades, with Democrats repealing them when in power and Republicans reinstating them upon taking control. Republicans also passed laws to close the polls at sunset, based on the assumption that illegal votes would be cast after dark. Democrats countered that these sunset laws block workers from voting. Right? Think about it. If you work 9 to 5, you can say, okay, I get off at 5. The polls stay open to 7 or 9. I can go vote after work and I don't lose any money. But if the polls are open 9 to 5, you get the picture. Early 1880s, Chicago's elite, losing power to Democratic politicians, began to advocate reforms to preserve the purity of the ballot box, including a burdensome registration system. At the same time, they set out to discover evidence of fraud to boost their reform agenda. We're going to see efforts to discover evidence of fraud in modern times. We'll talk about that a little bit. They hired investigators to monitor polling locations and offered a $300 reward to anyone who helped in the apprehension and conviction of anyone who voted illegally in Chicago in 1883. The allegedly illegal voters the effort produced were acquitted in court, right? So someone got the $300 reward to turn you in. They were all acquitted. No one was found to have been voting illegally. 1885. Despite the lack of evidence of fraud, Illinois enacted a new voter registration system drafted by the state's elites. Under these reforms, voters in some cities were required to register in person on the 3rd or 4th Tuesday before a general election. Again, when you give someone 1 day to register, you're making it really hard for hourly workers, for poor folks. Election clerks, accompanied by the police, would then conduct a house-to-house canvass of every would-be voter and create a suspect list of anyone potentially registered improperly. Oh, that sounds really good, right? Anyone on this suspect list would not be eligible to vote unless he appeared on the Tuesday 2 weeks prior to a general election with convincing evidence of his eligibility. The entire process would be repeated every 4 years. The Chicago elites celebrated that the foundations for honest elections were now firmly laid. Okay. 1911, New Jersey, in a progressive era effort to squash corruption, erected major hurdles to voter registration, but only in cities of more than 5,000 people. Whenever a voter moved or sat out an election, he had to re-register. Think about that. Right? If you moved from one neighborhood to another, from one side of town to the other, you had to re-register to vote. Registration was available only 4 days a year. Let that sink in. And the registration process required a prospective voter to list his occupation and the names of his spouse, parents, and landlord, as well as a satisfactory description of the dwelling in which he lived, as Keystone describes it. Turnout plummeted, especially among African Americans and immigrants. Sound familiar? The mid-20th century, voter purges and administrative barriers to registration persisted, contributing to chronically low turnout in the United States compared to other Western democracies, which is still the case. On national elections, presidential elections, voter turnout is less than 60%, sometimes as low as 53, 54%. In non-presidential elections, voter turnout could be as low as 40%. It's a disgrace. It's a national disgrace. When voting rights advocates successfully pressed Congress to pass a bill to relax registration rules in 1992, former President George H.W. Bush vetoed it, calling the bill an open invitation to fraud and corruption. Right? I don't want to say that. I mean, we should be making it easier for people to register. Okay? And forgive me, but if you don't want to make it easier, you want to make it harder for people to register, it means you want to have fewer people voting, because you have the belief that certain groups, working poor, the elderly, African Americans, Latinos, who stereotypically vote Democrat, it'll be harder for them to register and they'll be less likely to vote. From 2010 to the present, Republicans who took control of state government across the country after the 2010 elections passed a rash of restrictive voter laws as anti-fraud measures. These reforms included voter identification laws, restrictions on early voting, and requirements that people provide proof of citizenship to register. They have done little to stamp out in-person voter fraud, which is virtually non-existent. But they do impede voters of color, the poor, the elderly, and young people from casting ballots. A federal appeals court found in 2016 that North Carolina's voter ID requirements target African Americans with almost surgical precision. A federal court in Texas ruled in 2017 that the state's voter ID law, passed under the pretense of fraud deterrence, purposefully discriminated against African Americans and Latinos. Right? And so I would say the clearly, perhaps the most obvious and most controversial effort at voter suppression involves voter IDs. And looking at, I'll be fair, I could have found numerous cases which showed that fraud did impact elections. But if you look at the big picture, if you look at the trend, the trend has been to try and put obstacles up to lower the number of Blacks, poor, and elderly who vote. Because Black, poor, and elderly, again, generally, stereotypically, vote for a more liberal political agenda, vote for Democrat. And when the Republicans took control in 2010, one of the ways they sought to stay in power is to allow fewer people to vote. So let's look at some facts on voter IDs. About 11% of US citizens, which is over 21 million Americans, do not have government-issued photo IDs. Those most likely to have proper IDs are students, seniors, low-income Americans, and non-white Americans. About 25% of voting age African Americans don't have a government-issued photo ID, typically a driver's license. Poor people tend not to own cars, so they don't have a driver's license, right? 25%, compared to only 8% of whites voting age. 8% versus 25%. 18% of Americans over 65 don't have a government-issued photo ID, right? Because I've seen it from my mother, my mother-in-law. At a certain point, you stop driving. You don't drive. You get rid of your driver's license, right? Voter ID laws say that a voter must possess proof of identity to vote. The more recent voter ID laws passed in 31 states tighten up the form of IDs to be used. They differ from state to state. So let me go back on that previous point. So take students as an example. Some states will let students use their student ID card. Other states won't. I think it was Texas. Had this crazy law that they wouldn't accept college student IDs as a valid form of identification, but I think they accepted your NRA card. It was something crazy like that. I'm not 100% sure I'm getting my facts right, but you get these crazy things state to state. Right? Voter fraud itself does not refer specifically to voter ID fraud. Voter ID fraud is one of many types of electoral fraud. We've talked about that. So, but by requiring voter IDs, you're making it harder. It's shown to be able to vote if you are poor, if you're elderly, if you're black. At the turn of the 20th century, the South enforced a poll tax to prevent poor people, specifically black people, from voter registration and voting. The 15th Amendment that specifically gave blacks the right to vote was passed in 1868 and ratified in 1870. It was only until 1965 with the Voter Registration Act of 65 that blacks were really able to vote in significant numbers in the South. It took a constitutional amendment, 24th Amendment, which banned the use of poll taxes in the South. Poll taxes were just one of many things they did. The phrase grandfather clause came to invent, so that they said, well, if your grandfather voted, you were eligible to vote, which meant all whites were eligible to vote, but no black was eligible to vote because their grandfathers were slaves. Voter ID laws are seen by some as a modern form of poll tax, as many of the county's poorest will not vote due to lack of proper state-issued ID. States, I remember in Georgia when they started doing it, they limited the number. If you didn't have a driver's license, you had to go to a specific office to get an alternative ID. And there were very few offices, and they had limited hours. So, the state could argue, yes, there's an alternative to a driver's license, but in Georgia, they made it very, very difficult to obtain one. The new voter ID laws were enacted by Republicans. Voter ID laws will mainly impact would-be voters for the Democratic Party. That's a fact. Voter ID laws are mainly passed in swing states where preventing a win by Democrats could mean a Republican victory. Hence the example of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's been a swing state in the last several elections. Trump won Pennsylvania in 2016, which was one of his keys to victory. Voter ID laws make it harder for poor people, students, and the elderly to vote because they're less likely to have a valid form of state-issued ID. So imagine those of you who still want to vote in person. You stopped driving 10 years ago. You don't have a driver's license anymore. Are you able, or is it going to be easy for you to get to some state office in downtown Atlanta between the hours of 10 and 1 on a given day to get an alternative ID form? It'd probably be hard. And in the end, you'll go, it's not worth it. That's what they're hoping you would say. Some states offer free ID cards. In order to get a free ID card, a voter needs another form of ID, sort of like a catch-22. To get an ID, you need an ID. 12% of voting age U.S. citizens don't have a valid form of state ID. In order to obtain a free ID, they need a certified copy of birth certificate, which costs from $10 to $45 depending on the state, a passport, which costs $85, and certified naturalization papers, which cost $20, okay? If you're a poor person, I don't have 30, 40, 50, however money to get a certified copy of my birth certificate. And by the way, to get a passport, you need photographs, which cost money. You need access to a computer, or you have to go to an office to get the form. It ain't easy. So even these free IDs are not free. So I want to share with you this chart. So Wisconsin passed voter ID laws. This is a breakdown of who in Wisconsin would need a photo ID to vote under their bill. So 23% of seniors, 70% of white men and women, 55% of African American men, 49% of African American women, 46% of Hispanic men, 59% of Hispanic women, 78% of African American men between 18 and 24, 66% of African American women between the ages of 18 and 24. Right? If you want to see where the burden is, I don't have an ID and I have to figure out where to get one, look where the burden is falling. Okay? African Americans, Latino, and then elderly. Now, President Trump has also gotten into the act. In case you're not familiar with this case, let's go over it. In the days after he assumed office, Donald Trump claimed that 3 to 5 million fraudulent ballots had been cast for Hillary Clinton. He claims this because while he won the Electoral College, I think we had a class, those of you remember, we talked about how the Electoral College works. He lost the popular vote. He's the fifth individual to lose the popular vote but win the Electoral College, and this bothered him. He hates the fact that Hillary beat him at the polls. So in response to this alleged voter fraud, President Trump in May 2017 named Chris Kobach of Kansas to head up a Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. Kobach had previously served as Secretary of State of Kansas, where he implemented some of the strictest voter identification laws in the history of the United States and fought to remove nearly 20,000 registered voters from the state's voters' rolls. Following considerable investigation and persecution, Kobach secured 9 convictions for voter fraud. All were cases of double voting, and most involved voters who had misunderstood their voting rights. So he worked really hard in Kansas to prove voter fraud. He got 9 convictions. And this is the guy who believes that voter fraud is everywhere, that President Trump appointed to his Advisory Commission on Electoral Integrity. Now, Kobach's mission in his new position was to root out fraudulent voter registrations and fraudulent voting. That's what he said his mission was. But as you would expect, the right applauded the move. They thought this was great because, again, as we talked about, the right focuses on theory and believes that voter fraud is everywhere. The left was appalled. In the words of Vanita Gupta, who was the head of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division under President Obama, the commission is, quote, a pretext to kick millions of eligible voters off the rolls and undermine the sanctity of our election systems. So what was the outcome? Let's see what they did. The commission's first formal act was to request the states to send it their voter registration list, including personal information such as social security numbers. This request was met with bipartisan opposition. Although some states did send information, no state fully complied with the request. Most states replied as they would have replied to any public request for voter registration list. The request for voter file list, along with the secrecy that surrounded the committee decision-making, led to a number of lawsuits. Who's this commission to get my information, my social security number? Right? Remember, we vote in secret. And so there was a lot of controversy, even in the process. In January 2018, right, not even a year after he started up, Trump terminated the commission. Despite the high-minded charge given to the commission, it was clear all along that it had a narrow mission: vigorously pursue the claim that there were millions of double voters and non-citizen voters in the 2016 election. Of course, it could not find any facts to support the president's allegations of voter fraud. So the president appointed his commission to prove that he actually won the popular vote because there were 3 to 5 million fraudulent votes. Guess what? There weren't. He lost the popular vote. So, why you should care? Why you should care? It's a good discussion. Maybe it's been an interesting lecture. Hopefully you haven't turned it off or paused by this point. Why should you care? A Georgia law prevented 87,000 people from voting in 2018, and it could have a big impact in 2020. Now, I have a link here, and I'm going to open this link. We're going to see if it works because it'll take me to this website. Let's see if it's going to work. Good. You should be seeing the website. I went to the website because in the website it has a link. This story was initially reported by WAB, that's public radio here in Atlanta. So I'm going to, it's about a 5-minute clip, 6-minute clip. Let's listen to the story about voter registration and how 87 people were purged from the voting rolls in 2018. Remember, Stacey Abrams lost the election by 50,000 votes. So that was Georgia in 2018. Let's talk about the primary election just a few weeks ago. If you get the local paper, if you follow the news, you know what went on. It was a disaster. And so many people around the nation are saying Georgia is now ground zero for voter suppression. The state's largest newspaper summed up the crisis on the morning after Tuesday's primary election in the state descended into chaos. Complete meltdown. I saw that headline, and it was true. Kristen Clark, the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law, excuse me, ticked off the evidence of a system that is failing voters. Malfunctioning machines, long lines, polling sites that open late, and insufficient numbers of backup paper ballots in Georgia. Now, if you read the stories and you followed it, the Secretary of State said it wasn't our fault. We had fewer polling sites available to us because of fears of COVID-19. Many people who had manned the polls in the past didn't show up because of fears of COVID-19. But I read more than one account that people were there said the machines didn't work. They didn't have the passwords to get in the machines. You're supposed to have what they call, and you've heard it referred to, provisional ballots. They didn't have enough provisional ballots, so the machines didn't work. They didn't have enough paper ballots for people to vote. It was a mess. And remember, this was just a primary. I'm terrified what's going to happen in the November election. The Georgia primary was such a fiasco, such an overwhelming affront to the basic premises of American democracy that it cries out for a response. By the way, reading here comes from an article I found online by a publication called The Nation. And I picked it because it's not a local one, but it's interesting to see an outsider's perspective on the craziness that's going on in Georgia. But that response cannot begin or end in one state. If Wisconsin's chaotic April 7th election, when voters who did not receive absentee ballots were forced to wait in line for hours during a peak period of the pandemic to cast in-person ballots, was an early wake-up call for November, then Georgia's chaotic June 9th elections 2 months later must be understood as an urgent demand to get up and get going. The system is broken in many states. Wisconsin also has voter ID laws. Wisconsin, if you read the reports, in Milwaukee, I'll back up. The Republicans in the Wisconsin legislature fought and went to court to delay the primary election. They insisted that the election take place. They fought against absentee ballots. In the city of Milwaukee, they had, instead of 180 polling stations, they had 5 that were open. And to their credit, you had people stand in line for hours and hours and hours and hours in the middle of the pandemic to vote. Honestly, I don't know that I would have done that. I got an absentee ballot for the June primary. It was supposed to be earlier. I think I'm going to get an absentee ballot for November also, because I'm not so sure that this new normal we're living in won't be still the normal come November. But what we saw in Wisconsin, we saw in Georgia, the system is a mess. And there are efforts across the country. In Texas, for instance, you can get an absentee ballot automatically if you're over 65. You don't have to show that you need a reason to get an absentee ballot. So the Democratic Secretary of State wanted to extend that to people under 65 in the face of the pandemic. The Republicans in Texas took it to court, and the courts ruled in favor of the Republicans. They said the state law is that you have to be 65 or older to automatically get an absentee ballot. Trump incorrectly claimed that California was sending every voter an absentee ballot. No, California was sending every voter an application to get an absentee ballot. But the question we all should be asking is, why are you afraid of absentee ballots? Is it because it will make it easier for people to vote? And so you have more people voting, which you would think should be the goal of an election in a democracy. The more of us vote, the more fairly representative are the outcomes of the election. So my plea to you as we wrap this up, and I thank you for your patience in listening on this, my plea to you is be sure to vote this November. If you've not yet requested an absentee ballot, talk to Amanda or other people in the building. Get your applications in for absentee ballots. Even if you're capable of going to the polls, stay home. It's easier. I did an absentee ballot for the first time this year. It was very simple. Took a pen in 5 minutes. Vote. I don't care who you vote for. I mean, I have my preferences, and that's the topic for another discussion. But in America, the right to vote is what defines our democracy and is a basic right American citizens have. Please exercise your right. Get those absentee ballots and vote, no matter who you vote for. This is a key election year, presidential election. Both Georgia Senate seats are being voted upon this year. Purdue's an incumbent. Isaacson stepped down. So there's a possibility that there might be 2 new senators from Georgia. It's an important election. So thank you for listening. And I am going to stop the share. And so I will sign off right now. Have a good day, everyone. I'll speak to you soon. Bye-bye.